Welcome everyone to this video on de-identification of sensitive data and how this can be facilitated with our tool, the SPHN Connector. My name is Sabine Österle. I'm the lead semantic strategy and fair data team at the Data Coordination Center of the Swiss Personalized Health Network. And with me here today is my colleague Vasundra Touré, who will later in this video dive into more technical details. Before we start with the technical details, I would like to quickly give you an introduction to de-identification of sensitive data and why we are doing that. And I think the reason is very simple. I think we want to prevent that a patient in a data set can be re-identified to preserve the privacy of that patient. Also, we have to be compliant with laws and regulation, as for example, the Human Research Ordinance or the Federal Act of Data Protection. As we will see also in the following slides, I think there is never 100% guarantee that you cannot find out who a patient was in case you have sufficient information. However, it is our obligation as researchers to minimize this risk as good as we can. But how can we do this? How can we minimize the risk? And I think, or first also, how can we determine the risk, how high the re-identification potential is? What is very obvious for, I think, all of us is that depending on which type of data I have of a patient, my risk is maybe higher or lower. So for example, if I have omics data like genomics, the risk of identifying a patient is very high. Also, if I have a lot of data, so I can have a lot of characteristics of a patient, also then the potential risk of re-identification is higher. Of course, we can always mitigate the risks. This is what we can do with so-called de-identification rule, where I will talk to you about in the next slide. But of course, yeah, it's always, I think, you can't leave away certain data in case you need them for your research. But also, there is a kind what we call contextual risk. So really meaning, what is the whole setup of that project? Who are the people participating? Where are these people located? What kind of education do they have? Do they have a certain education on it? And last but not least, the contractual and the IT risk. So this means what kind of contracts are in place to share the data? What are the kind of things which are regulated in this contract? What are kind of policies actually the researcher have to follow when analyzing the data? And of course, that is also all somehow complemented with on what kind of infrastructure am I analyzing the data? What is the kind of security measures this infrastructure takes into place? How do users get access to this infrastructure? How is the authentication and authorization process happening on that? What is the kind of firewalls in place? What is the kind of overall setting which is done? So all of that actually we summarized in what we call the data de-identification templates. So here you find a template where you can actually answer all the different questions and will actually determine the risk of your data set or of your patients in your data set to be re-identified. And I think with that, you can then always take different measures to actually reduce this risk. And all of that can be reflected here in this templates. So when we talk about the SPHN connector, you have heard that in the previous videos, is a data transformation pipeline. So we take data from the source and actually convert it into a semantically rich format. So we cannot do anything about IT security. We cannot do anything about contractual risk with such a tool. But what we can do is actually we can apply certain de-identification rules on the data. So what can be done is on the one side, for example, that identifiers are replaced by pseudonyms, meaning, for example, the internal hospital's patient ID or also the internal hospital's sample ID. These can be replaced by a project-specific identifier. They can also be removed completely. Of course, if you remove these identifiers completely, then it means you cannot do iterative data transfers because you don't know that this is the same patient as the patient you, for example, sent in the previous data deliveries. On the dates, what we can do is we can do so-called date shifts. So you determine a random number in a certain range. For example, you would say, I would like to shift all my patients by plus minus 30 days. So then for each patient, a random number between 0 and 30 is picked, and all dates are shifted by this random number. This ensures that actually the order of events is still in place and you have really the temporal relations within your data, which is unaltered. But you, for example, wouldn't know anymore what was the exact birth date of a patient, which of course may be an identifying criteria. What is also possible, and what we're currently working on to implement in the connector, is that you can strip off the exact dates, meaning that, for example, you decide that a granularity of only knowing the year when, for example, the birth date was is sufficient, then you can remove these data elements. One other thing which goes very deep into the data, which can be done, but not in an automated way, as for example with the connector, is to remove sensitive data elements. This could, for example, be locations or occupations where you can either try to generalize it. So instead of saying he lives in Terville, you could say he lives in a small city, or you could say he lives in a certain canton. So with that, you are like also here going to a less precise definition of a certain data element, which gets a lower risk for the re-identification. Exactly the same for the occupations. You can put it into more general categories, or you can remove this data elements completely. So with that introduction, I would like to hand over to Vasundhara Toure, who will really show you off what can be done in the connector and also how we do it.
The SPHN connector enables you to define some rules that you can provide during the project configuration to apply the identification to your data that you're transforming into RDF. You basically have to put those rules into a JSON file and upload it into the upload external files endpoint of the connector. And you have to make sure to select the de-identification config into the file type. Make sure that you do this step after you have created the project in the connector, but before that you actually start the pipeline and ingest the data. Now we will see what are the rules that are supported in the connector. So you have 4 possible types of de-identification that can be done: date shift, scramble field, substitute field list, and regex. So with the date shift, you can basically indicate a range within which you want your date times to be shifted, and the connector basically picks one value out of this range and applies that to all the date times that are linked to a patient. In this example, the date got shifted by minus 11 days, and here by minus 14 days. Then you can also do a scramble field where basically a unique identifier is generated for instances of specified property values. So here in this example, we want to apply to the administrative case identifiers a scramble field. So all the identifiers of the administrative case get transformed with the de-identified value. The substitute field list enables you to provide a list of instances that you would like to de-identify. You can observe here that we applied this example to the subject pseudo identifiers, so basically the patient IDs. And we only want to apply that to patient 1 and patient 2. So in the results, you will have, or in the RDF data generated, you will have for patient 1 a de-identified value, but for patient 3, for instance, since it's not listed here, will remain with the same ID in the RDF data. Similarly, you can apply a substitute field regex, where basically you define a pattern that if it is matched in an instance, then it will be de-identified. In this example, patient 3 is actually matched with the regex that is given, and therefore it gets changed with a de-identified value. So these were the de-identification rules that the connector supports, but what does the connector not do? It doesn't do any range binning. So if you have data of a patient which is 25 years old, it will not put you this patient into a bin of 16 to 30 years old, so you don't know the exact age of the patient, for example. The connector doesn't do data generalization. If you have data coming from University Hospital of Basel and it doesn't matter too much to the project where exactly the data came from, the data will not get generalized to just university hospital, for instance. And also the connector is not intelligent um, to remove identifying information from free text that you may provide with your data. So for instance, if you have in a field, patient X was transferred into room 123 into the maternity ward, the connector will not remove the information about the patient and the exact room location, for example. So this is something you have to carefully assess before providing the data into the connector to remove in the free text possible identifying information. In SPHN, we have some minimum recommendation on the rules that could be applied for the identification, specifically identifiers of the patient, the sample, and the administrative case must be de-identified, and applying a standard date shift of plus minus 30 days would be recommendable. This is how the JSON configuration file would look like for such a minimum de-identification rule. You can specify the fields you would like to scramble. So these are given here. It's basically the subject pseudo-identifier IDs, administrative case IDs, and the sample IDs. And also the date shift here is a default date shift that we apply to all the data that gets processed by the connector, where all the date times are shifted between minus 30 and plus 30 days. Some final remarks. So with the SPHN connector, you can have a report that gets generated to keep track of these de-identified elements with their original identifiers or values. But there's also the possibility to fully anonymize the data where you would not get any report generated. So you need to assess whether you would need possibly this mapping for maybe iterative data transformation of same patients, for instance, or if it's just a single shot of data conversion that you're doing and you don't want to keep track of the de-identified IDs with your original IDs. And please note that it's not mandatory to use the SPHN connector for such de-identification capabilities. This is an optional step that we enable you to use if needed. But as a data provider, you can, of course, also have your own pipeline that already performs these steps. Maybe you have even more sophisticated ways to do such de-identification. So that's why it's an optional step in the connector. With that, you can find some references which contain more information about the de-identification that can be applied into the SPHN connector. And thank you for your attention.